It was a Sunday afternoon at Easton Town Center in Columbus, Ohio, and the world was as close to perfect as it ever gets for a man on leave. Sophie was wearing her new blue dress, the one she had picked herself from the rack at Target the previous Saturday, with the focused deliberation of an 8-year-old who understands that this is important. And she was spinning in the atrium near the fountain, the hem flaring out around her, completely absorbed in the specific joy of a child who has her father's full attention for the first time in 6 months. The air smelled like cinnamon from the bakery 2 stores down. A jazz trio was playing near the entrance. I had a coffee in my hand and nowhere to be for 12 days. I am Cole Barnes. I am 34 years old, a staff sergeant in the United States Army, currently assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and I had just come off a 7-month deployment that had taken me through 3 countries and 1 extended stretch in a forward operating base where the most reliable luxury was hot water every 3rd morning. I came home lean and quiet and grateful for the ordinary. The smell of Sophie's shampoo when she ran into the hallway and hit me at knee height, the sound of the neighborhood at night, the specific weight of nothing urgent requiring my immediate attention. We had been at Easton for 2 hours. Sophie had a soft pretzel and a new book about ocean animals. I had watched her spin in that dress approximately 11 times, and each time felt like the first. Then she gripped my hand, not the casual grip of a child reaching for her father in a crowd, the grip of a child who has sensed something wrong before she can name it. Her fingernails pressed into my palm. She said my name quietly and pulled herself close to my leg. I looked down at her face. Her eyes were fixed on something ahead. I looked up. A man stood outside the entrance to the restrooms 20 feet away. He wasn't moving. He was wearing a charcoal wool suit in a shopping mall on a Sunday afternoon. Not odd in itself, but the stillness was wrong. He was watching Sophie with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting, which is a different quality of attention than anything accidental. He was speaking quietly into a phone held close to his face. My heart rate did not increase. This is something people misunderstand about trained soldiers. When genuine danger registers, the body does not panic. It slows. The blood cools. The mind narrows to the problem with the kind of clean, unhurried clarity that only arrives when everything irrelevant has been removed. I held Sophie's hand and walked us smoothly away from the fountain toward the center of the atrium, putting the crowd between us and the man in the suit. I kept my pace unhurried. I kept my face neutral. I was reading the situation the way I had been trained to read situations, not with fear, but with assessment. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Hit that like if you've ever had a moment where something changed and you felt it before you could name it. Back to Cole. What I did not know yet, standing in that Columbus shopping mall with my daughter's hand in mine, was that the man in the charcoal suit was named Brian Hartman, that he worked for a private investigations firm in Dublin, Ohio, and that he had been tracking our movements for 6 months on behalf of someone who had the resources to pay for 6 months of surveillance on an Army sergeant and his 8-year-old daughter. What I did not know yet was that the person who had paid for it was someone I had once tried to welcome into my life as family. What I did not know was that the folder in Hartman's briefcase contained photographs of Sophie and me going back to the week I came home from deployment, at the grocery store, at the school pickup line, at the McDonald's drive-thru. On the Friday night, we celebrated her straight-A report card, each one captioned with language designed to make ordinary love look like evidence of failure. I didn't know any of that yet, but I knew the man in the charcoal suit was not lost. And I knew that a threat deferred is not a threat destroyed. I picked Sophie up, held her against my chest, and moved. I did not run. Running broadcasts panic, and panic is information you do not give to someone who is trying to use your fear against you. I walked us into the dense crowd near the department store entrance, putting bodies between us and Hartman, and I kept moving until we were in the security office on the ground floor, a small, windowless room with monitors on 3 walls and a middle-aged man behind the desk who looked up from a bag of chips with the specific expression of someone who had not been expecting company. I set Sophie in the chair by the door and put my military ID on his desk. I told him what I had seen, where, and when. I told him I needed the second-floor restroom footage pulled immediately. I told him there was a man in a charcoal wool suit currently on the premises who had been conducting what appeared to be targeted surveillance of a minor, and that if he did not pull the footage in the next 5 minutes, I would call Columbus PD myself, and he could explain to the responding officers why he had declined to act. The security chief pulled the footage. Hartman was visible on 4 cameras across a 40-minute window. He had followed us from the parking structure, tracked us through the mall, and positioned himself outside the restrooms when Sophie had gone in with me. He had made 2 phone calls during that time. He had not been shopping. He had not been meeting anyone. He had been working. Columbus PD arrived within 15 minutes. Hartman was located near the north exit, detained without resistance, and escorted to the precinct. Sophie and I followed in a patrol car. She sat very close to me in the back seat and did not say much, which for a child who generally has a great deal to say, told me what I needed to know about what she had understood from the afternoon. At the precinct, I was told that Hartman had invoked his status as a licensed private investigator operating under a client contract and had been released pending review. The detective assigned to the case, a woman named Reyes, told me this with the careful apologetic tone of someone delivering news they know is not acceptable. I asked for the client's name. She said she could not provide it at that stage of the investigation. I did not need her to. There was only one person in my life who had the money to hire a private investigator for a sustained 6-month operation. The motivation to surveil a military sergeant's daily routine, and the particular combination of arrogance and careful cruelty required to target an 8-year-old child. My mother-in-law, Eleanor Whitfield. My wife Diane had been killed in a car accident 22 months earlier, 3 days before I was scheduled to come home from my second tour. She had been driving back from her mother's house in Upper Arlington on a wet November night. The accident was investigated, ruled as single vehicle, attributed to road conditions. I had come home to a folded flag and a daughter who had just watched her mother be buried and was now watching her father try to learn in real time how to be both parents at once. Eleanor had attended the funeral in a black Chanel suit and pearl earrings. She had spoken warmly at the graveside about her daughter's life and her granddaughter's future. She had looked at me across the grave with an expression I had cataloged and filed in the part of my mind that stores things requiring later attention. Eleanor Whitfield was a woman who had raised her daughter to marry someone from a different category of life than the one I occupied. Diane had not complied. For the 12 years of our marriage, Eleanor's opinion of me had been delivered in the specific register of upper-class Ohio disapproval, the kind that never raises its voice, because raising one's voice would be common, but that makes itself known in every interaction through carefully selected language and the studied absence of warmth. After Diane died, that disapproval had found a new direction. I was at Fort Bragg with Sophie, enrolled in the school on base, managing the specific impossible logistics of single parenthood combined with military service, and Eleanor was in her Upper Arlington mansion, deciding that my daughter's life was a problem she had the resources to solve. That was the thing I had not fully understood until Hartman's briefcase was opened, and I saw what was inside. Eleanor did not simply disapprove of me, she had decided to act on it. 3 days after the incident at Easton, Detective Reyes called me. Hartman had been charged with criminal stalking of a minor. The client contract in his briefcase which identified Eleanor Whitfield by name as the party who had retained his services under a project designated in his files as Target Reconstruction, had been entered into evidence. The contract included a scope of work that specified documentation of the subject's living environment, parenting practices, financial status, and daily routine for purposes of supporting a custody modification petition. Eleanor had not filed the petition yet. She had been building the file first. Reyes told me the file in Hartman's briefcase was substantial. She asked if I wanted to come in and review it. I told her I would be there in an hour. What I found in that blue folder was the most thorough documentation of my ordinary life I had ever encountered, assembled with the specific purpose of making ordinary love look like neglect. There was a photograph of me asleep on the couch after a 48-hour field exercise, still in my AC use. Sophie sitting beside me on the floor, building something from Lego. The caption, typed, clinical, described the scene as a subject in a state of extreme fatigue, unable to engage with child, environment of neglect. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I had come home from that exercise at 2 in the morning, and I had been on the couch rather than in bed, because Sophie had fallen asleep on the living room floor waiting for me, and I had not wanted to move her and had sat down next to her and gone out immediately. I remembered that night. I remembered what it felt like to sit next to her on the floor with the lamp still on and feel the specific relief of being home. The caption had turned that into a crime. There was a photograph of us at the McDonald's drive-thru. A Friday night. Sophie's report card dinner. Her choice. The caption described poor nutritional standards and routine substitution of fast food for parental presence. There were photographs of the apartment at Fort Bragg, annotated with observations about square footage and proximity to training facilities and the presence of military equipment in the storage space. There were photographs of Sophie's school, her bus stop, the playground where she played after school on Tuesdays. 6 months. They had been watching us for 6 months, and every normal thing we did had been recorded and rewritten into something that looked, in the aggregate of the file, like a case. The final documents in the folder were the ones that changed the temperature in the room. A pre-filled enrollment contract for a boarding school in Virginia, 800 miles from Fort Bragg. The school's intake form had Sophie's name already written in Eleanor's handwriting. Attached to it was a personal letter from Eleanor to the headmaster describing her granddaughter's circumstances in language. I am going to summarize, rather than repeat, because some of what she wrote about Diane and about me, and about what she called the contamination of her granddaughter's upbringing by proximity to the military culture, is not language that deserves to be reproduced in full. The letter made clear that Eleanor did not want custody of Sophie, in the way that a grandparent wants to be near a grandchild. She wanted to send Sophie to an institution where, as she wrote, all traces of the current environment could be corrected. She wanted to ship an 8-year-old 800 miles away to remove her from her father. The final document was a financial comparison. My sergeant's salary, my housing allowance, my savings. The Miller-Whitfield family trust value, the real estate holdings, Eleanor's inheritance. The conclusion was highlighted. Economic leverage recommended. Subject lacks financial capacity to compete in prolonged legal proceeding. Recommend initiating petition to exploit differential. She had been building a case. She had hired a man to document it. And she had a financial plan for wearing me down in court. I closed the folder and placed it on Detective Reyes's desk and thanked her for showing it to me. Then I called a lawyer. My brother-in-law Ryan called me that evening. Ryan Whitfield was Eleanor's son, Diane's younger brother, and a man I had spent 12 years maintaining a careful, functional relationship with, cordial at holidays, distant in between, the kind of relationship that works by not requiring too much of either party. He had never been hostile to me. He had also never been particularly present, which I had come to understand was his default mode in situations that required him to choose between his mother's expectations and anything that conflicted with them. His call came at 9 in the evening. He sounded out of breath and concerned, and several degrees too informed about what had happened at Easton for someone who had learned about it through normal channels. I had not told him. The police had not released names. We had been at the precinct for less than an hour before he'd heard. I asked him how he knew. The pause that followed was long enough to tell me everything. He said something about social media, about someone posting something, about a gut feeling when he heard. His voice had the specific unraveling quality of a man reading from a script he had not adequately memorized. I told him I would talk to him tomorrow and ended the call. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after that. Sophie was asleep. The apartment was quiet. I had the blue folder's contents organized on the table in front of me. The photographs, the enrollment contract, the financial comparison, and I added to it now the timeline of Ryan's knowledge. He had known about Easton before it was possible to know about it, through any channel that did not connect back to Hartman or to Eleanor. He had been part of this. The question was, how much? The answer came 2 days later, when I did a systematic check of the apartment. Ryan had been to the apartment 4 times in the previous 2 months. He had offered to check on things when I had overnight exercises, water the plants, be present in the building in case something came up. I had given him a key. I had believed him. Behind the framed photograph of Diane and me on our wedding day, taped to the backing, was a small listening device, a high-gain bug, the kind available through security equipment retailers, with a range sufficient to cover the apartment's main living area and transmit to a receiver located within a block radius. He had not been watering plants. I removed the device and held it in my hand, and thought about what it had recorded. Sophie doing her homework at the kitchen table. Sophie asking me questions about her mother that I answered as carefully and honestly as I could. The conversations I had tried to be present for, the ordinary evenings that were the whole of the work of being a parent, all of it fed back to Eleanor Whitfield in her Upper Arlington mansion. Ryan came by that evening. He came through the door with a pizza box and the easy manner of a man who believed the visit was routine. I placed the listening device and the wire transfer receipt I had found in his coat pocket the previous day. $5,000 to Hartman Investigative Services. Memo line reading Project Polaris initial retainer on the coffee table and waited for him to see them. He saw them. What followed was not a confrontation in the dramatic sense. It was a reckoning. Ryan sat in the armchair across from me, and the performance of casual concern fell away, and what was underneath was a man who was genuinely frightened, not of me, but of himself, of what he had done, of the specific shape of the thing he had allowed his mother to make him part of. He told me Eleanor had promised him control over Sophie's trust fund if the custody petition succeeded. He told me he owed money, a significant amount, the kind that has a different quality of urgency, and that Eleanor had found the debt and offered to absorb it in exchange for his help. He told me he had told himself it was for Sophie's benefit, and that he had known, while telling himself this, that it was not true. I told him to leave. I told him to leave before Sophie woke up in the morning and found him there, because Sophie deserved to have the people in her kitchen be people who had not helped build a case to take her away from her father. He left. The next morning, I called my attorney, a woman named Carla Marsh in Columbus, and I told her everything. I told her about Hartman and the folder and the listening device, and Ryan and the wire transfer receipt and the enrollment contract. I told her about the financial comparison Eleanor had made and the plan it outlined. Carla listened without interrupting. Then she told me what we were going to do. And if you've been listening to this, if any part of this story has sat close to something in your own life, hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment. It genuinely matters. It's what makes it possible to keep telling these stories. Okay, back to Cole. Because Eleanor Whitfield was about to walk into a courtroom with her pearls and her lawyer and her 5-figure retainer, and she was about to find out what happens when you build a case against a man who has spent 15 years being trained to understand the difference between what a situation looks like and what it actually is. The Franklin County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning has the specific atmosphere of a place where things become official, where decisions that have been building in private are finally given the weight of public record. I arrived in my Class A dress uniform, every crease sharp, every medal in the correct position. Not as a performance, I was not there to impress anyone with the uniform. But because the uniform was the accurate representation of what I was, and accuracy seemed important on a day when the other side had spent 6 months trying to replace accuracy with their version. Eleanor arrived, as Eleanor always arrived, in a manner calibrated to communicate that she was accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around her. Chanel suit, pearl necklace, a lawyer beside her, whose billing rate Carla had mentioned with the specificity of someone who wanted me to understand. We were not operating at the same financial altitude. Eleanor did not acknowledge me when she walked in. To Eleanor, I was the obstruction between her and the outcome she had decided was correct, which meant I was a problem to be addressed through process rather than a person to be engaged with directly. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Carla presented the Hartman contract, the 6 months of surveillance, the enrollment contract with Sophie's name already filled in, Eleanor's letter to the boarding school headmaster, the listening device recovered from my apartment, the wire transfer receipt connecting Ryan to the Hartman retainer, the financial comparison document from the blue folder with its highlighted recommendation to use economic pressure to force compliance. Eleanor's lawyer raised objections. Some were sustained, most were not. The judge, a woman with silver hair and the specific manner of someone who has presided over enough of these hearings to recognize the pattern quickly, asked Eleanor directly whether she had authorized the hiring of Hartman Investigative Services to surveil her son-in-law and granddaughter. Eleanor's lawyer began to respond on her behalf. The judge stopped him. She asked Eleanor again. Eleanor said she had retained an investigator to document her granddaughter's living conditions because she had legitimate concerns about the child's welfare. The judge looked at the enrollment contract. She looked at Eleanor's letter to the headmaster. She looked at the financial comparison document. Then she issued a 5-year restraining order. Eleanor Whitfield was required to maintain a distance of 1,000 feet from Sophie and from me. No contact, no communication through intermediaries, no further legal action regarding custody, without first demonstrating a material change in circumstances to a standard the judge outlined in terms that left very little interpretive flexibility. Hartman's client contract was forwarded to the county prosecutor's office for review of additional charges. The hearing ended. Eleanor's lawyer guided her out of the courtroom with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to managing exits under difficult circumstances. As she passed me, she looked at me once. It was a look I recognized, not defeat, which implies acceptance, but the specific cold focus of someone who has lost a battle and is already accounting for the war. Her expression said that the restraining order was a setback, and that setbacks were temporary. I looked back at her, and I thought about the folder, about the photograph of Sophie and me on the couch, about the caption that had described my exhaustion after a 48-hour exercise as evidence of neglect, about the 6 months of ordinary love that had been documented with the intention of converting it into proof that I was unfit. I thought about what it had cost her to build that case, the money, the time, the coordination, the deliberate decision to turn a private investigator loose on an 8-year-old girl and her father. All of it assembled in service of a belief that her money and her standing entitled her to override a father's love with a grandmother's judgment. I thought, you spent 6 months building that file, and I spent 6 months being the thing you were trying to document. The difference between us was not the resources, it was what we had done with them. The first weeks after the hearing were quiet in the way that things go quiet after sustained noise. Not peaceful yet, but still. The apartment without the listening device felt different. The air in the rooms had a quality it had not had before, which was that conversations held in them belonged only to the people having them. I removed everything Ryan had brought to the apartment over the previous months, the gifts for Sophie, the objects of casual friendship, the accumulated evidence of visits I now understood differently. I put them in a bag and set the bag by the door and did not overthink what to do with it, because overthinking it would have meant giving it more weight than it deserved. What I focused on was Sophie. Sophie had watched a man in a shopping mall track her through a public space. She had watched police arrive and lawyers talk, and her father spend 3 hours in a courthouse. She had been told, in the measured and age-appropriate way I had tried to construct, that some people had wanted to change where she lived, and that the judge had decided she was staying with me. She had received this information with the specific, dignified composure of a child who is processing something significant and has decided not to fall apart until she is ready to. She was not all right immediately. She woke up twice in the first week with the kind of dreams that have no content you can name, just fear and the need for someone to be there. I was there. Both times. I sat in her room until she went back to sleep. These were not the moments of dramatic parenting. No speeches, no wisdom offered. Just presence, which is the thing I had been providing for 2 years, and which Eleanor's blue folder had tried to reframe as neglect. Presence is not dramatic. It does not photograph well for custody documentation. But it is the whole of the work. Ryan came back 6 weeks after the hearing, not to the door. He had enough sense to understand that showing up at the door was not available to him. He came to the mailbox at the end of the driveway, and he left an envelope, and he stood across the street in the rain without an umbrella, which is either a gesture of penance or very poor planning, and I could not tell from the kitchen window which it was. The envelope contained legal documents. Ryan had filed a voluntary and irrevocable waiver of his right to manage or influence Sophie's trust fund. He had transferred all associated control to a third-party fiduciary firm with no connection to the Whitfield family. The document had been prepared by an attorney and notarized and was binding. There was a handwritten note at the bottom of the last page. He said he was in a program. He said he had cut ties with Eleanor, not just limited contact, cut. He said he was working at a lumber yard in Grove City. He said he was not asking for forgiveness. He said he was trying to become the person his sister had believed he could be. I read it twice, and then I stood at the kitchen window and thought about Ryan. Not the Ryan who had taped a listening device behind my wedding photograph, but the Ryan who had existed before that, the brother-in-law who had driven 4 hours to be at Diane's funeral, and who had held Sophie when she cried, and who had, until Eleanor found his debt and his weakness, been someone I had cautiously trusted. I am not going to describe this as an easy decision or a clear one. The betrayal was real, and it had consequences. Sophie had been watched, followed, documented. The listening device had recorded conversations that were private and sacred, and that belonged to no one outside this apartment. But I had also watched, across 2 years, a man who was fundamentally weak rather than fundamentally cruel get recruited into something by a woman who understood his weakness better than he did. There is a difference. I will not pretend there is not. I walked to the end of the driveway. I did not cross the street. I stood where he could see me. I told him to go home and get dry and come back the following evening for dinner and not to be late. He looked at me across the wet asphalt with an expression I recognized as the specific look of a person who has been given something they know they did not earn and is trying to understand what is expected of them in return. I told him, probation, weekly accountant, honesty, one deception, one single deception, and it was finished permanently. I was not offering restoration. I was offering the possibility of earning it. He came the next evening at 5 minutes to 6. He brought a small Lego set that cost about $10 and that he said he had bought with his first paycheck from the lumberyard. Sophie sat on the floor with him after dinner, and they built it together, and the conversation she had with him was entirely about her science project and an ocean animal book she had read twice and whether seahorses could be trained. I watched from the kitchen. Eleanor's trajectory had a different shape. The restraining order proceedings had been covered by the Columbus Dispatch in a brief but accurate piece that connected the Hartman stalking charge to the Whitfield family name. In Upper Arlington, where social standing is maintained through careful management of public information, this had consequences of the kind that money cannot easily repair. Several of Eleanor's longtime social connections had created strategic distance. The country club board had declined to renew her committee appointment. She was still in the mansion. She still had the money. But the mansion was quiet in a way that it had not been when Diane was alive and Ryan was present, and the family had the shape Eleanor had designed for it. She had built a structure and then dismantled it herself, piece by piece, using her own money and her own choices and her own certainty that what she wanted was more important than what anyone around her needed. I did not feel satisfaction about this exactly. What I felt was the specific quiet of a thing being finished. 14 months after Easton, on a Thursday morning in April, I stood on the stage of the Fort Bragg Auditorium with my boots polished and my uniform pressed, and my daughter in the front row wearing the expression she wears when she is trying to look calm, but her eyes are giving everything away. The commanding officer removed the staff sergeant chevrons from my shoulders and replaced them with the rank of Master Sergeant. It is not a dramatic moment from the outside. A general pins new metal to a uniform and says some words, and the audience applauds. But the weight of it, the specific accumulation of what it represents, the 15 years of decisions made correctly under pressure, the particular proof of having been assessed by people whose assessment is rigorous and finding that you met the standard, that weight is real and it is not transferable, and Eleanor Whitfield's entire family trust could not purchase 1 milligram of it. I had been given 10 minutes at the podium. I had prepared remarks. Military ceremonies have a format, and the format serves a purpose, which is to say the important things efficiently and to honor the people present without wasting their time. I had prepared remarks that fit the format. I set them aside. I looked out at the auditorium, uniformed men and women in rows, families at the edges, Sophie in the front row, Ryan beside her with his phone up and his eyes wet in a way he was not trying to hide, which was a different Ryan than the one I had known before, and one that I was still forming a considered opinion about. I talked about the myth that service and fatherhood are competing demands, that the uniform and the responsibility of raising a child occupy the same territory, and one must give ground to the other. I have heard this framing my entire career. I heard it in the blue folder, rendered in the clinical language of a custody case. Subject demonstrates inability to provide adequate parental environment due to occupational demands. I told the auditorium what I had learned, which is this: the occupational demands and the fatherhood are not competing forces. They are the same force, directed at different targets. You go into the mud and the cold and the extended distance of deployment for the same reason you sit on the bedroom floor at 2 in the morning when your daughter can't sleep. Because someone you are responsible for needs you to be present and capable and not afraid, and the question of whether that presence is expressed in a forward operating base in another country or in a small apartment at Fort Bragg is a logistical detail, not a moral one. The people who tried to use my absence as evidence of my inadequacy as a father had not understood this. They had looked at the photographs of exhaustion and fast food and a small apartment and seen proof of failure. They had not understood that all of those things were the residue of being present, of coming home at 2 a.m. and sleeping next to my daughter rather than in the bed, of celebrating a report card at the place she chose rather than the place that would photograph well. Love is not photogenic. It does not hold still for documentation. It is the thing that happens in the gaps, in the 40 minutes between getting home and getting Sophie to sleep, in the phone calls from overseas that cost $3 a minute and were worth every cent, in the specific quality of attention you bring to a child who needs you to be there rather than somewhere better or more impressive. Eleanor Whitfield had tried to buy my daughter's future. She had assembled 6 months of documentation and a 5-figure budget and a custody petition and a boarding school contract. What she had not been able to buy was Sophie's answer in the county courthouse on a Tuesday morning when a social worker asked her where she wanted to live. Sophie had said, "With my dad." 3 words, no deliberation. The same answer she would give every morning if you asked her, and every night before she went to sleep, and every time in between, because it was not a considered position or a strategic response. It was just the true thing. I finished my remarks. After the ceremony, in the parking lot, Sophie took off my service cap and put it on her own head. It dropped immediately to her eyebrows, and she said she wanted to be a soldier when she grew up. I knelt down and adjusted the cap so she could see me. I told her, "Don't be like me. Be better. Be smarter and kinder and braver in all the ways I wasn't. I am not leaving you a trust fund or a mansion or a name that opens doors. I am leaving you the knowledge of what you watched your father do when someone tried to take you. I am leaving you the understanding that worth is not measured in bank accounts or zip codes or the opinions of people who have confused money with virtue. I am leaving you yourself. That is enough. That is everything." She nodded with the seriousness of a child receiving information she intends to keep. Ryan drove us home. Sophie sang along to something on the radio from the back seat, loudly and incorrectly, which is the correct way to sing in a car. The base gate flag moved in the spring air in the rearview mirror. The road ahead was long and ordinary in all the ways that ordinary is a gift. I had learned, across the previous 14 months, what Eleanor Whitfield had never understood. The people who come for you with money and documentation and the certainty that resources equal rights are counting on you to respond in kind, to lawyer up, to drain yourself dry, matching their budget, to let the fight consume the life you are fighting for. They are counting on the contest to become the story. The answer is not to refuse the fight. The answer is to remain the thing you were before the fight started. To keep coming home, to keep being present in the small, undocumented moments that no private investigator will ever photograph because they do not look like evidence of anything except a father and his daughter having a normal Tuesday. That is the whole of it. Show up. Stay present. Trust that love, documented or not, is the thing that lasts. They came for what I had built. What they could not take was what I was.